Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about mobilization. This is one of the most basic ideas within defensive play. We're talking about bringing our pieces to the battlefield where our king is being attacked. We actually saw a similar idea recently. We saw in chapter 18 the idea of bringing the pieces to the attack. And basically, this is something similar. It's like if it was a soccer game, we have to bring our players also to the battlefield in order to avoid getting outnumbered. Please notice that in this context, it's not always clear exactly which task our piece will take up, the piece that we're bringing to the defense. We simply know that its presence in the battle will be very useful for us. So in the examples that I have here, I would like to show some different cases of different pieces being brought to the defense. And in several examples, you will actually see multiple pieces joining the battle, joining the defense. So let's start with our first example. I would say it's a rather simple yet very useful one. In this game between Schwerz with the white pieces and Sorokin playing black, we can see that if we look at the pawn structure, you would say that black is better here because white has this weak pawn on d3, they have a weak pawn on e5. Black has no weaknesses, you could say, traditionally speaking, and also black is possessing the semi-open d file where they can attack this pawn on d3. On the other hand, you can see that white has more space, and very often when we have more space, we have greater chances of an attack. And since white has this pawn on e5, I said it was a weakness, but it's also a strength in any attacking context, as we are controlling this very important square on f6 with the white pieces, So black should be careful here. You can see that white, they have indeed more pieces in the attack on the king side, and black has defenders. We have at least 1 and 2 and 3 pieces, and the knight is waiting to get into the battle, while black is basically left alone with the rook. And as we commented in other occasions, not always the rook on f8 is that great a defender. We would like to have someone else there, if you know what I mean. So black should be careful here. You can see that what white would like to do, they would like to bring the knight to the attack. We said that recently, not right now, because if they would move the knight somewhere, well, black would probably take the opportunity to trade queens, the typical idea of defensive exchanges. They will just love to trade queens because the endgame would be great for them, taking into account their better pawn structure. So, safe to say, white will do some preparatory action here. Maybe they will play something like king h1 first, or they will bring the rook to the fourth rank so that they control this square. Maybe later on they can put the rook on g4 and bring in the knight and so on. So, interesting ideas for white. You can also see, of course, that's impossible to ignore that there are some ideas with some sacrifice on f6, right? We should be careful about that. Maybe not right now, but it might come soon. And if you imagine the other rook, for example, landing on f6 at some point, or maybe rook f6 first, you can already imagine that, right? G takes, queen takes. Suddenly, they are actually having mating threats. So black should be careful, but the solution is very simple. I don't think that Sorokin thought for a long time about his next move here. He knew he needed more people on the king side, and he hurried to play here the move knight e7. So this is easy to understand. Once the knight settles on, let's say, f5 or g6, evidently our king is going to feel a lot safer. For example, if I try this fancy move, rook f6 that we were talking about, black could simply play here. We don't take because it's very likely that we get mated with 2 mating threats to take into account. So we would ignore that sacrifice and simply bring our knight. I think you could actually put it on both squares, but okay, knight f5 is nicer because we're probably winning the exchange here when we play this move, because now the knight is also defending on h6, sorry. So let's see what happened in the game. White didn't like the idea of the knight settling on f5, so they played here g4. We cannot use the f5 square anymore, so Sorokin logically put his knight on g6 instead. So that's a great place for the knight. It's already taking some squares from white, and at the same time we're starting to put some pressure on the pawn on e5. So we would like to perhaps put the queen there also, and in this case it will be more difficult for white to defend the pawn. White tried in this game g5. That's a typical method of opening up lines for the attack that we looked at in chapter 18. G5, trying to open up the h file. At this point, I think in the game black played here queen c7. They simply brought about simplifications. White took on h6, of course black should not take back. They took instead on e5 with the queen, and here white said, okay, this time my attack won't work. It's not really that promising. They just traded queens, queen takes, knight takes, and the game was later drawn here after pawn takes, king takes, and some check, I think. And sorry, it was difficult for black to also win this game. White is very active. But interestingly, meanwhile, this is not a bad outcome for black to make a draw here. But there was another move that I wanted to ask you. Do you think we could somehow give up something to help our defensive task here? At least for the moment. Aha, we can actually give up this pawn, h5. So you would say, playing like this, we help them to open up the h file. But since we have this gigantic knight on g6, it won't be easy for them to break through. You can see that if the rook takes h3, yeah, they are not even threatening queen h3, right? Their mate is not working anymore. They would need more time to bring in the knight, perhaps. But we can take the moment, of course, to take the pawn on d3. Fantastic endgame. So many weaknesses in White's camp. So after h5, they have to play something else. I looked at this move knight f4. That's what we call aggressive exchanges. We saw that also in chapter 18. Maybe you remember, for example, Niemann's. No, it was not Niemann. No, it was Garev who played rook a1 and he traded off the opponent's rook on a8. Perhaps you remember that, or Aryan who played bishop g5, trading off the bishop on e7 in that King's Indian attack structure. Anyway, same idea, knight f4, trying to trade off this knight, but as you can see, after black takes on f4, knight takes, I think we take with rook here with white so as to avoid the trade of queens. Black would play g6, some kind of blockade on the king side. Very difficult for white to break through here. You can see that black could safely start doubling up on the d file. For example, rook hf3 and queen c7. We continue here with rook d7 and rook fd8. We're keeping track of the pawn on f7, and it's very, very difficult for white to break through here in this position. So simple example, not very difficult to understand. You don't have to calculate that much. That's another thing about this concept of mobilization. It's about common sense, you could say. Bring in the pieces, forget about other action, forget about, I don't know, playing b5, things like that. It will have to wait until later. We need to bring more pieces to the party here. Knight e7, crucial move. We're bringing the knight a little closer to the king side, making our king feel somewhat safer. All right, next example. It's similar in the way it's the defender is thinking, but it's more complex, the things that will happen on the board. In this example between with white pieces Schmidt-Deal and playing black Radovanovic, you can see that this time the defender's king, I mean white's king in this case, it's rather exposed. You can see that black's pieces are very close. The queen would like to come to h8 perhaps, or to g8 and try to get that white's king. There are plans like bishop g4, bishop f3 also, and of course also there is a check on g4 to be careful about. So what white did here, they made a very good choice. They didn't take on h3 at this point. After rook takes h3, black would try to bring in the queen, for example, like this. This would be very dangerous for white. What they did in the game, they played instead, they brought somebody to the defense, a piece which is right now not very active. So I think you know which move I'm talking about, right? That's completely right. Knight f1, very good move. That knight, if black wants to take it, it's okay, because we keep our other very powerful knight. I wanted to say also that the knight is a great helper for the king, since it's so strong in its near area. It can touch so many squares around it. It's very powerful. So not surprisingly, in the context of mobilization, we very often see these knight transfers, as we just saw, by the way, Sorokin's knight move, knight c8 to e7. So nice move, knight f1. Let's see what happened here in the game. They played here bishop g4. Yeah, we know the idea already. Try to put the bishop on f3 and create mating threats. I looked at some other moves. For example, if black indeed takes on f1, we take with the king, and we will be ready to run away with the king. This would be okay, probably, for white. If rook h1 check, of course, don't stay, then there might be problems coming up. It's better to run away. And also we can start our own attack at some point. You can see that black's king is not completely safe, so you could try something like bring in the queen later and help the attack, while the king is rather safe at this point. So in the game they played instead bishop g4. White hurried to bring their knight to the defensive post on g3. As simple as that. Knight f1, knight g3. More pieces around white's king. That's great for us. Black played here. You can see that they can't really do this due to the bishop f3 fails to the fork on f5, so black played here queen h8. They are using the same concept as you can see, mobilizing the pieces to the attack in this case. White played here queen a3 because they had calculated that they could actually start their own attack. Again, bishop f3 won't work. And by the way, I forgot to say also that if you take this pawn on d5 at some point, the pawn on d5 here, I mean, that would be a problem with bishop e6, I think. If you take, it's simply too much. Maybe there is something with bishop f3, but black will have some problems if white sacrifices on f7. So a simple refutation here will be bishop e6, and the knight is pinned, unfortunately. So let's just forget about taking pawns and focus on king safety. Queen a3. Well, not exactly king safety. We feel that our king is safe since we have the knight on g3. So what we're doing now is we're trying to bring the queen to the attack, because there was not so much else that the queen was doing. So at this point, black played queen e8. In this way, they are bringing back the queen to take control of this square. So perhaps they lost some time also with the queen. And at this point, white has a very interesting choice, because in the game they played what also the computer likes, but I don't like it so much. They played at this point rook takes b7. So it's possible to play like this. Let us just see very quickly what happened in the game. Black, of course, now they use the queen in this way. You can see that the queen is starting to trying to enter on the first rank somehow. White played at this point queen e7. We had a very, very complex tactical battle. That was queen c1 check. White had to play. You can see that there are mating ideas coming up, so they have to play knight f1. I think you can guess black's next move here. Of course, they played rook h1, king takes, queen takes, and some very heavy complications here. King h2, queen f2. I think white was winning somewhere in these variations, but the game was eventually a draw here. A very sharp battle, and it was almost impossible to calculate this from the beginning. And this was move 37 in the game at this point after queen e8. So I think even if that line is winning, Stockfish would like to play like that. But humans, we should look for some more practical approach. So what do you think? Can you think of some practical idea for white here? How to get a safe advantage without too much calculation involved? Aha, we can actually trade off the queens here using the threat against f7. You got it. Queen e7. That's a very practical move. That's a very nice move, since, yeah, we are touching this pawn on f7. They can't really let us take that. That will be mating threats with the knight also. So queen takes, probably we take back. And as you can see, this is exactly what white wanted. They wanted a safe endgame. The king will not be in too much danger when queens are off the board. The pawn on b7 is hanging, and obviously the b6 pawn would become very powerful. Black will have to play something else. Bishop c8 is possible, but then I think we can attack this pawn instead, right? Oh, I was going to say rook e5, but in my notes I have rook c7 instead. All right, this looks fine also to bring the rook to c5, attacking two pawns at the same time. So 97 perhaps by black, and we would take then on d5. We have won a pawn, I think, and we are having a nice advantage in this endgame. Rook on the 7th rank and so on. So interesting example. You can see that white's king was in danger, but a timely maneuver with a knight to help the king greatly helped white's case here. Also by using common sense, you would say. From all my pieces, let's see here, the rook, the knight, the queen, the other knight. Well, that knight is really passing now. This knight is not doing too much, so let's use it. Similar to the previous example, now where the knight on c8 went to e7. We simply try to use all our pieces. That's common sense in chess. Not to have spectators in your camp, but to use them all. So knight f1, very useful maneuver to remember. Okay, maybe we could have a look at another piece now. We saw the knight here in two examples. I would like to show you something featuring the bishop. So in our next example, we have a very, very complex battle. This is a Slav, semi-Slav perhaps, something like that. No, queen's gambit accepted, all right. In any case, you have this very prominent bishop on b7. See, black is targeting white along the long diagonal, but obviously at the same time we can also see that black's king is a bit weak, especially you can see white has a pawn on f6, so this means that there might be mating ideas and so on g7. So what white noticed here was that black was about to play rook g8, targeting the pawn on g2, and obviously black would also like to maybe double up, bring the other rook to g8 and attack with all their pieces against the g2 pawn. At the same time, you can see that there is a passed pawn on d3, which could distract white at some moment. But okay, white, of course, they have the bishop pair. all their pieces are active, so they should be okay here also. But which would be the best approach here? What do you think? How could we make life a little safer for our king here? That's right, sometimes backhorse moves, they are the best ones. Bishop d1, that's what white played here in this game between Moisenko with white and Kuzubov with the black pieces. So bishop d1, very quickly, we bring the bishop to f3, where it will actually skewer black's queen along the long diagonal. And now there were some very interesting complications here. In this kind of position, you go all in, I think, at least with black. There are no real possibilities for slower play. You have to be very active. So knight takes f6, that's what black played here. You can see rook takes, fails to mate on g2. So white wanted to continue with their plan, but first, of course, they have to take care of their queen. In the game, they played here the very precise move, queen c5. It might appear more logical to keep the queen on the king side, but if you play, for example, queen h3, trying to protect this pawn, black had this interesting move, queen e5. Very, very complex, but basically we are defending the knight and we are getting ready to move it to e4. This will be black's aggressive plan in this case. And you can see that this diagonal, yeah, we didn't talk so much about that, but the a1, h8 diagonal is also important. If white could plant the piece on that diagonal, tactically black will be in huge difficulty. So it's clear that black would like to keep their queen on that diagonal and at any moment prevent white's move bishop d4. So for that reason, the queen goes to c5 instead, so that we are ready to perhaps play queen d4, or on some occasion maybe bishop d2, and try to bring a piece to that diagonal. That's really white's key idea here. Moisenko analyzed this position. He explained that black should have played rook ac8 here, bringing more pieces to the attack, or simply developing them, trying to get rid of white's queen. Queen e7, knight g8. That's what he analyzes, and queen d6 with interesting compensation for the pawn. And I think so, I agree. Maybe not winning, but white seems to have a more pleasant game here. Personally, I'm happy when my opponent's knight has to go like backwards, not attacking my king anymore. That's good news for me. So I would be happy to play white here. In any case, in the game they played here rook g8, and here white continued with their bishop maneuver. They played now bishop f3. But before we play this move, we should ask ourselves the question: what if black takes on g2? How would you take back on d2? That's the big question here. Aha, after rook takes d2, which was happening in the game, now it's not so much about strategy, it's more about tactics. After rook takes d2, there is actually only one good capture for us, because maybe the first thing you would say, okay, with the rook I can't take because they take with the queen. That's bad for me, but why not take with the king? Well, in that case, you and me, we have missed something here. What do you think black would play? Aha, cheap tactics. You remember using pins in this occasion for the attack. You're right, the bishop on f3 is pinned, so black would play here queen g4, very nice, and then bishop takes f3. Dangers on the sky here for white. You can see that queen g2 might be an idea later on. So that's a pitfall to be avoided. Now we know that we have to play here instead bishop takes g2. But I'm just telling you that it's not that simple, no? I could, of course, just say that, yeah, white played here bishop f3 and neutralizing the black attack. But at the same time, before playing that, white really had to make sure that this crazy sacrifice, rook takes g2, wouldn't work. So definitely some calculation was involved. Bishop takes, but then black plays rook g8, right? So how on earth do you cope with this threat? But here comes the very nice move. It looks like a forbidden move, the kind of move that you would not dare to play. You say, oh, I would love to play that one, but it's bad because I lose a whole rook. But that doesn't matter. It's a tactical battle now, so everything is, you could say, allowed. And we talked about this many times, that when there are multiple pieces hanging and so on, there are like more possibilities. So bishop g5, incredible move, but very, very strong. White gives up a whole rook, since they have noticed that there is also a threat now against the knight on f6. So queen takes e1 check, rook f1. Perhaps black missed this, that white could give away the rook like that. Now, as you can see, black is in huge trouble because bishop takes with it, check is coming up next. So they sack the queen here. Queen takes f1 and white took back, king takes, bishop takes. Always we have to be a little careful when we are about to win the game. At this point you can see that we have a typical case of a non-recapture. If we take on g2, we would invite d2 now that the bishop is pinned along the g file. So don't do that, please. There are some tactics here. You can see that maybe they can take next turn and queen the pawn and things like that. If white tries to keep, oh, actually they can't do that. Yeah, sorry, queen d4. I guess they will just take straight away. Yeah, white don't want this, of course. So in the game, Moisenko played simply king e1. Nobody told us that we have to take back every time they take something. It's better, to, of course, to leave that bishop where it is, because now we can take care of the pawn, and also we have the threat, big threat of bishop takes f6. Knight e4 will just fail, I think, to queen d4 or queen e5 maybe. Aha, this doesn't make sense for black, really. So in the game they play d2 check. And yeah, definitely don't take with the king, please, here. They took with the bishop in the game. Bishop takes d2, bishop d5. White took another pawn on b4, not so much for the pawn, perhaps, but in order to play bishop c3. Later on, white went on to win. So simple case, but okay, it has some heavy tactical content. But the simple idea, bringing the bishop to the defense, here it has to go backwards, bishop d1, in order to go to f3, strengthening white's control of the light squares. Let's have a look at our next example. Actually, if you remember this one, you will find the solution in the next one very quickly. Believe me, take my word for it. In this next example, in the French defense, Ray Robson with white and Vovk playing with the black pieces, Yuri Vovk. If you just remember the previous example, you will very quickly find black's best move here, in this position with opposite castle kings and both sides trying to attack. That's right, the same idea. We bring a bishop to the defense, and actually we also bring it to the attack. Bishop e8, this is the right move. We bring the bishop to g6. Fantastic maneuver by Vovk. In this way, he's strengthening his king side, and at the same time, he's also helping his attack on the queen side. One move, of course, that I should cover here is what you would think is the solution when you look at this for the first time. You see a tactical strike here. Oh, of course, simple one, easy one. Rook takes f4, of course. So that if he takes on f4, I go bishop g5. But since white has so many pieces in the attack, this is actually not so clear, because white can play here the move, knight f6. So this is tricky already for black. You can see that after pawn takes, they can now pin the bishop here with rook g1, and things would not be so simple. So what black can play here is instead queen takes f6. Interesting, because both queens are hanging. And you get this kind of double-edged endgame. E takes f6, bishop takes f4. Black is to exchange down, but they will push e5 and so on. Interesting for black also. Probably black is not worse in this position, but what he plays in the game is actually more interesting. He plays this very nice move, bishop e8. Beautiful bishop transfer. White continued here with their attack, I think. Knight f6 check. They have to act quickly. If rook g1, we will just play bishop g6. That was just one tactical detail that I wanted to touch upon. If white plays here knight f6, we should actually not take with a pawn. This is, yeah, according to the logic of attack and defense. So many pieces in the attack, white can actually sacrifice something here. They won't win the game, but they will make a draw. They can take here. It's an interesting tactical variation. Let's see if I remember it. Rook takes h7, black takes black. We give check on h4, and they play king g7. Exactly. And now the key idea here is simply to take on g6. This is not so convincing, because I can bring my queen to protect the bishop, but rook takes g6, this actually makes a draw for white. Rook takes, king takes, queen check, and after king f7, queen h5, black's king cannot escape. This will be a draw. I'm definite that Vovk and noticed this variation, and he actually went for more, or he would have gone for more after knight f6. He would have played like in the game instead. He would have played bishop takes f6, I think. And here you can see an interesting variation, e takes f6, rook takes f6. We can actually give up the exchange here. Yeah, we have this for later. Now we can take here later. Bishop takes, queen takes. Any French player will enjoy this play with black, or also any non-French player. This looks very nice for black. You can see that also queen f5 is an idea at some point. Some mating ideas and so on, if white tries to play the seed pawn. So yeah, that's what could happen here after bishop e8 if white goes rook g1. But Robson went all in. He played here knight f6. We know the idea already. If we take with the pawn, white has this perpetual idea, sacking the two rooks and making a draw with the queen, as we just saw. So in the game, black took with the bishop instead. They are playing for a win here. Sorry, basically. So e takes, of course, you know the next move here, bishop g6, the pawn on g7. We will leave it as a shelter for our king. That's the pawn shield that we will talk about a little later in chapter 23, I think about the blockade. Rook f7. So if we take stock at this moment, we can see that White is a pawn up, I think, but as very often happens when you have opposite color bishops on the board, one side has greater attacking chances than the other, no? Or I could also say, in positions with opposite color bishops on the board, the defense becomes a bit more difficult because we can't, I mean, white in this case, they can't really cover the light squares properly because they have a dark square bishop. So black has a very nice initiative here. There are several ideas for black. They could try to bring the queen to this side, but even stronger is the plan that Wolf prepares in the game. Well, depends also, of course, on white's next move here. But in the first place, there is the threat of rook takes e2, although it's not clear exactly at what moment will black play that, because they have such a nice bishop on g6 that we don't want to perhaps lose at this moment. So let's check quickly what happened in the game here. They played in the game bishop e5, protecting the pawn on e5, and here Wolfke didn't want to take on c2. Had he done that, you can see that after rook takes, something about the relative value of the pieces, queen takes, bishop takes, king takes, it wouldn't be that convincing because this pawn would be very strong and black would need to always look after it, I mean to look after their back rank also. It's something that we can keep in the pocket for later. So what black did in the game, he played his fancy move, queen g5. Very pretty move, working on the pin, you could say, using the pin. We're not really going to take anything there on f4, but we are using the pin so that if they take on g5, we take on f2, and we have, yeah, a lot of pressure against white's king in this case. So after queen g5, white ignored this and they just played rook e3, and here black is about to put the queen on f5 at some moment, but the queen is not really under an attack. First they took on c2, bishop takes c2, and after yeah, now you can see that if queen takes e2, by the way, since the queen got to g5, rook takes, king takes, we have queen g2, I think. So that's the reason why black is now eager to take on c2. White played king d2, and as you can imagine already here, it's black who is attacking, not white anymore. Bishop g6, clever retreat, the queen is coming to f5, and more specifically rook c2 is in the air. Rook c1, defensive trade. That's the topic of the next chapter, by the way, defensive exchanges. White's trying to neutralize black's attack. Unfortunately, with opposite color bishops in this case, there is a lot of attacking potential. Rook takes, king takes. You can guess black's next move. Of course, we talked about it already. The queen is getting ready to attack. Queen e2, sorry, and here d4. Why did I play this move? What do you think is the point behind that pawn push? That's completely correct. We're not really after the f4 pawn. It's more about trying to bring the rook to c7 quickly. We would like to deflect white's bishop, or in the opposite case, continue to run with the pawn. And that's what's happened in the game. They played here rook b3, and after queen b1, king d2, queen c2 check, king e1. Now black played nice move d3. They didn't want to trade queens, of course, but under this circumstance, it's okay, because after queen takes, pawn takes, as you can see, the pawn basically queens, because, yeah, if we look at this king d2, you can see black comes very quickly with the rook and so on, so this is impossible for white. They played in the game queen d1, black continued here with attack, rook d7, clever move, so that after pawn takes, the king cannot get closer, and at the same time we're ready to play d2. Of course, if that pawn reaches the second rank, that's basically the end for white. Usually past pawns, when they get to the penultimate rank, they're already too deadly, you could say, for the opponent. Rook takes before d2, king e2. There were different ways to win here, but there was one pitfall I remember. Aha, we must not play bishop d3. If you play that, I'm very sorry, but that's a terrible idea. White will play here king e3, and as you can see, there is something with mate coming up. So don't do that, please. And Wolf played something much safer. He took on d1. It was possible to give check on the other side also, but this was stronger, because if that, you have queen c5 later on. So, but queen takes d1 was much nicer. King takes d1 and bishop h5. Black wins. White resigned here, or they resigned perhaps on the previous move. You could, of course, also give the check on c2 if you prefer that. But okay, this looks nicer to keep the bishop. In any case, we're queening next turn, so the game is over. Very nice exercise, or very nice exercise about how we can improve our pieces. This bishop was actually not doing too much on c6, and it had a fantastic destiny on g6, where it would combine attacking and defensive tasks. Very important to like plug the G file. We're back in the obstruction chapter, when you remember we would put pieces on specific files, for example, in order to frustrate the opponent's attack. That's what we're doing here with this very nice maneuver. Okay, we should perhaps talk about some other pieces. I wanted to talk about the rook, also how we can use the rook for defensive purposes, and in our next example we can see how this can be done. With white pieces, Thorfinnsson, and playing black is Steingrimsson, two strong players from Iceland. You can see that white is playing for an attack. The king side is a bit weak in this kind of structure. Definitely white is just waiting for the moment to play something like knight f5 after perhaps taking, or they would play something like bishop h6, or perhaps even knight h5. Several ideas come to mind here. You would say black's pawn structure is great in the long run. We have these two passed pawns basically, or king side pawn majority, while we're blocking the d-pawn, but at the same time king safety, that's the main issue here. How could you possibly make life safer for black's king here? Which piece could be brought to the defense quickly? Well, since I told you something about which was the kind of piece involved, you can of course imagine black's next move. Aha, you got it. Very nice move. They played here rook a6. This rook is coming to the king side, specifically to g6. That's the final destiny for the rook. Once it's there, its mere presence on the king side will definitely make white's attack a bit harder. White played bishop e3, simple development. You can see that if they go for their plan here with bishop takes c8, yeah, we take back. But first we could perhaps use an intermediate move, right? If we take here, I think they play knight f5, little annoying. So it's actually nicer if we start with an intermediate move, yeah, non-recaptures, rook g6, and then you can take on c8, and life would be rather safe here for black. Not easy to see how white's attack is going to progress once our rook is safely defending here, like queen someone or queen c4, and we take back on c8. They can always put a knight on f5. That's something we will have to live with. I think this is the best move. And in this kind of position, please notice that it's very nice to have the rook on this side of the board. If it was on the other side, as you can see, white would have ideas like queen g4, if you see what I mean. If the rook was on the normal place on the queen side, well, in that case, white would be having interesting attacking ideas with queen g4. So nice to have the rook on that side. In the game, they played bishop e3 after rook a6, and black continued with their plan. Of course, the bishop on f5 is pinned along the h3 c8 diagonal, so rook g6. That's a very convenient move to play here. White's queen doesn't really have any big future on the queen side. King side, we could just take on f5 and perhaps try to trade off the bishops. Well, not hanging the the knight, of course. Yeah, queen h5, maybe we can take first. Or I think, yeah, we take first and we play something like b6. Something like that's what I would play here. And again, I'm boring you with this, but again, please notice this rook is just fantastic. If it wasn't there, we would be scared here. There would be ideas like, let's say, bishop h6 and queen g4 check and things like that. If it was on, imagine on c8, for example. But here we're fairly safe in this position. So, all right, let's have a look at what happened in the game. Bishop e3, rook g6, queen c4. Black traded off at this point since the rook was under an attack. Bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, and it's time to safeguard the knight on c5. Yeah, b6. Exactly what I did in the other variation. You can see that I already learned this example, more or less what it's about. So black is okay here. You would say, okay, but this passed pawn is strong. But don't forget that we also have the rook covering the whole sixth rank. So right now, I think they can't really make that sacrifice work. Yeah, we would take back and put the queen somewhere if they try to pin us on the d file, or even some fancy move like queen a8, and we could actually target white's king, right? So that's probably not working here. If they put the rook on d1, I think we could play maybe bishop d6, and it seems to me that black is fairly safe. In the game, they played here after b6, b4, trying some action on the queen side. A takes b4, c takes b4. All right, question, where should we put that knight, and where is it going? Good point. We can put it on b7 so that it can come to d6 to take up some blockading task and also get rid of white's annoying knight on f5. So good move. White played here a4, and black simply traded off the bishops with bishop g5. This is what they played here. Clever move. The bishop was not that useful anyway, and we avoid the tension. Knight takes bishop, so to speak. So that's a convenient move. White took back on g5, and after queen takes g5, you can see that black is okay in this position, maybe slightly worse, but still fairly playable, defendable this position. The pawn is still not going to queen. We have the rook on the 6th rank. Right now they have to do something about the pawn on g2, and also perhaps we can later on bring in the knight. That would be strategically good, of course, to trade off white's knight for our passive knight on f5. Sorry, I'm saying the wrong way. We are trading our passive knight for white's active knight on f5. This is a strong knight, I'm trying to say. And our knight is not that glamorous on b7, so that makes plenty of sense. So nice, you could say, everyday defensive solution here by Stengrimsson. He noticed that his king was a bit exposed. He found a very clever way of bringing more pieces to the defense. He played in rook a6. Rook lift, usually these are associated with attacking play, but here you can see it's quite the opposite. We're using it for defensive purposes. Okay, another example featuring a similar rook maneuver. This is perhaps a more famous example. Kramnik with white, Judith Polgar with black. You can see that Judith Polgar went all in on the king side. She has plans of attacking against white's lonely king on g1. You can see that one idea for black here would be to play rook e8, followed by queen h5, perhaps rook h6. In this way, they will be targeting the pawn on h2. And exactly on the 2nd rank, that's where white would like to have some more protection. They would like to keep these squares under more control. Another interesting observation here is that if white plays the straightforward move f4, this would be very concrete, of course, concrete thinking, because we're forking the queen and knight, and at the same time black's queen cannot move to too many places because the rook is still hanging on d8. However, as you can see, black could force a draw here. Aha, that's right. Black would take on g3, queen takes, pawn takes, rook takes, and there would be checks combined with a knight check, so white's king would not be able to escape. So what Kramnik did, he wanted to play for a win here. He knew that his position was more healthy. We're talking about pawn structure, the pawn on d6 and things like that. So he introduced his rook into the defense. Which rook am I talking about? Aha, that rook, the rook on the left side, on the queen side. You got it. Typical prophylactic idea, rook a2. Very nice. This is not something that you have to calculate it, but you can also by common sense understand that if you put a rook like that, you later on play f3 or f4, and you're able to put the rook on g2, of course. This will make the king very happy, similar to the previous example where black brought the rook to g6 and their king felt much safer. So that's what happened here in the game. Judith Polgar played rook f8 so that she doesn't have to worry about this rook anymore, and she can continue the plan here of queen h5 and rook h6. And now Kramnik sticks to his plan here. He plays f4, since now that there is no sacrifice anymore because white will always be able to interpose with the rook. So queen g4 was played in the game. We should not take that knight, that would be too greedy. You can see black's move here, of course, knight takes c3, black breaks through. Even if we have this rook on the board, it's not enough. As you can see, key variation here, rook g2, knight e2, and black wins by picking up the rook on g2. So after f4, queen g4, it was a good moment to bring in the rook with rook g2. That's perfectly possible. Kramnik first played here queen e7 to force the black rook to a war square. I think this is what you could say like comparative analysis. If we play rook g2 next move after black plays here rook g8, you can see that we have managed to weaken black's defense of the f5 square, which is useful in any tactical context. Now it's probably better to have black's rook on g8 and f8 for white, so that this pawn becomes a little more weak. So now Kramnik sticks to his plan, resumes the plan of transferring the rook to the king side. On other occasion, I should maybe also mention that on other occasion he could have kept the rook, of course, on a2, just surveilling the 2nd rank. For example, if black had focused on the h2 pawn instead. But since black is about to take on g3, it's evident that we would like to put the rook specifically on g2. But else, of course, in prophylactic fashion, you could say, we will see this in the chapter 22, we will see this, putting a rook on the 2nd rank can be extremely useful for defensive purposes, but in this case it's actually very important to conclude the rook maneuver, so to speak. Okay, I hope you see the difference. You can keep the rook there, or you can actually bring it to the king side. That's what makes it mobilization, so to speak, and here the latter is very important to have it here, taking care of the g3 pawn, avoiding any sacrifice on g3. So anyway, back to business here. Knight d3 was played in the game, and white simply took the pawn on a7. Not so much for the pawn itself. Kramnik has a different idea. Guess what he would like to do with the queen? I hope you didn't say take the pawn. No, there is something else he has in mind here. He would like to bring the queen to the defense as well. We will actually mobilize the queen now, because after the move h5, you did Portugal plays with great accuracy, with great logic. She uses all her possible resources for the attack. h5, h4, opening up lines for the attack. This is, of course, something that White should be very careful about how to defend against that. But Kramnik had his plan ready here. He played here queen a6. So the queen is coming to e2, where it will trade off Black's queen, or at least help the defense by one more player, so to speak, on the main battlefield. Black could have played h4, but I think Kramnik analyzes queen takes. And I think after h takes, yeah, now this is not so dangerous anymore because we have the queen a little closer. I think, yeah, what would we play? I'm just curious, what would we play against this move? I think we could just play rook f2, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, we could just defend like that. And yeah, probably. Still a little shaky, no? Rook h6. What would happen in that case? I don't really want to move away the rook, because then there might be threats on this side. Maybe there is some smarter move, like queen c2 maybe. Or king f2. Interesting also. King f2, that's an interesting move, right? If it was a bullet game, this is what I would play. King f2, you can see my idea, right? Knight h1, rook takes check. No, that's very important. And on the other side, knight e4. Oh, I was going to play like this, queen takes. But now I see that pawn takes rook. That's good for me, but they have queen h4. Yeah, what would happen in that case? Actually, I'm not so sure. This might be good for white also. No, king g1, pawn takes, and rook takes c6. I think white is winning here. We're up material, and we have a nasty plan coming up, counterattack, or maybe with the other rook. Anyway, not completely clear, but yeah, this is completely clear. But the whole variation, I mean, is not completely clear, but we can see that white has resources here after h4. In the game, black took on c1, and after rook takes e1, I think they played h4, and the rest is not so difficult. We talked about this, time to bring home the people. We have to defend our king here, so queen e2. Without further ado, we should trade off the queens. If they don't trade, well, there are things like that coming up also. Queen takes, they took here with a, yeah, how will you take back? Always careful, please don't take with a knight. I know you protect g3, but also you let me play h3, that would be a bit embarrassing for white. So of course, Kramnik takes here with the rook instead. After h takes, basically the attack is over. White is playing for an advantage here. There are different ways to play, but what he played is very convincing. He took on f5 with a knight, and after g takes h2, again, the non-recapture. He didn't take. He could have done that also, but he wanted to trade off the rook, so he played king h1 with the threat of rook takes h2. So very clever move. Black had to give up the rook here. I mean, give up the pawn. Rook g1 by trading rooks. Rook takes, pawn takes, king takes. White's pawn up, better structure. They went on to win here. Yeah, by the way, we have also the mating threat. That's true. But apart from that, you could see that an extra pawn is now, it's really heavy, you could say, in the end game. So white should win this, and that's what happened in the end. So nice example. I like the way he used his rook here. Rook a2, followed by f4 and rook g2. That was a very clever way to handle this position. The rook was not doing anything, so this was a golden opportunity. Please notice that not all pawn structures allow us to do this. No, it depends on the pawn structure, but here there are no white pawns on b2, c2, d2, and so on. So it's actually possible to carry out this plan. All right, let's have a look at another situation where we could use the rook. Here we see the rook is used in a horizontal way, but I would say mostly it's used vertically. That's what happened in our next example. In a Sicilian battle, we have with the white pieces Vocaturo playing black is Gomez Garrido. You can see that white's playing for an attack. I think this is the Sicilian attack in the Sicilian. You can see that from the bishop on b3 that it should be the Sicilian. So this is dangerous for black. Many threats coming up here. Could you think of two threats here for white? Two things that white would like to do here? It's always important to try to see through the opponent's threat. So one threat is very evident here. They would like to go f6, so that if we take back on f6, they will take with the rook, and we can't take back with a knight, because in that case, we are getting mated on g7. And the other, like disguised threat, is that they might be able to take on e6, and if we take back with a pawn, which is what we would like to do to keep this square under control, actually they will insist anyway. They can play this fancy move knight d5, because if we play e takes d5, in that case they would take back with the bishop, and you can see that they are forking us, right? So these are two big dangers. There is one move which combines, you could say, actions against both threats, and also helps us to bring the rook to the defense. Yeah, I'm not talking about this rook this time, it's too far away. It's the other rook, and for that reason there can only be one move. Of course, king h8. So this way, it's very simple, of course. The idea of preventing f6, we're also preventing the other threat, because this would not be fork anymore. But also we should notice that a nice feature of this move is that we're actually ready for rook g8 next turn. In the long run, we can also see that black's pawn structure is healthier now. So if they can survive the white assault, they will be doing fine in a future endgame or a queenless middle game and so on. All right, let's see what happened here in the game. White played in the game f6. They stick to their plan. Black can now take on f6, bishop takes f. They have to play that, else there are problems on the king side. So bishop takes f6, and white took on f6. We have 3 captures here, but it's easy to see which one we should choose, of course. Aha, we cannot take with the pawn on f6 because we dropped the rook on f8, so we should take the bishop instead. It's actually the most dangerous piece here from the two. It's more dangerous than the rook, I would say. So that's what happened in the game. White played rook takes h6. Superficial analysis would dictate that this helped white. They are now closer to mating us. But if you look a little closer, you will see that the pawn on h7, it can be secured in a very simple way. And that's exactly what happened. You got it. Rook g8, a typical motif, a typical pattern, you could say, in the Sicilian positions where you have double pawns on f6, such as in the classical Sicilian. It's good to know this plan. King h8 and rook g8. Also in the French, for example, it appears. In the French Rubinstein variation, I think, or in the Tarrasch. I think we have an example here in the course also. Wesley Saw with white and Georg Meyer with the black pieces. Similar example where you bring the rook to g8. So it's very good to know this method. After queen h4, you can see black is just in time to play rook g7. And for now, the pawn is safely defended. In the long run, as you can see, the pawn structure really favors black. We have a very nice square on e5, where we would love to put a knight, of course, but that's a long time away. But we can put the queen there meanwhile, perhaps. And these pieces are not very active at this point. So black is okay here, but okay, there are still some things to take care of. White used the idea of mobilization at this point. Aha, you got it. They played rook d3. Very nice. Boccaturo is bringing the last heavy piece to the attack. The rook is probably coming to h3. You could also consider something like rook g3, trying to trade off the rook on g7 to take on h7 next. But basically, I think it's rook h3 what's coming up next here. So at this point, actually, it's time for us again to bring another defender to the defense. We brought the rook, but we now have to bring someone else. So who do you think should join the defense, and how could that be done in the best way? Time to bring in the queen, but how? Yeah, you can use the vulnerability of white king for that. We can give a check and bring the queen a little closer. So if you play like this to bring the queen here, bad news. I would play king h1, and if you go queen g5, unfortunately, you run into rook takes h7. The rook is overloaded. But now we know the idea. Bring the queen to the dark squares. We should do it the opposite way, from the other side. Aha, backwards moves. That's always tough, but it's actually rather common in defensive play, so we should know the pattern. Queen b6 check, that's what Gomez Garrido played here. King f1 or king h1, I think it's the same thing basically, but he knew that perhaps the endgame was around the corner, and here queen d8. Very nice, beautiful move, very simple. I think Ulf Andersson would have agreed on this one. As you can see, we're winning a tempo by offering the trade of queens, and we're going to bring this queen to g5, most probably, where it will help our kingside defense, sorry. So what happened here in the game, they played in the game rook f3. So this is already like, what can you say? It's like pragmatic play by white. They're saying, okay, on this occasion, my attack, this day the attack won't lead to mate. I will go for an endgame instead. But if they try to insist here, I think I looked at some move here, queen h5, yeah, don't play queen g5, please, because then again we have the problem with rook takes f7, but now we can bring another piece. Aha, we can bring in the knight. The knight can even go to this square. We're talking about, again, backwards moves, but also it can go forward, it can go to g4. So both possibilities are indeed possible for black here. So yeah, queen d8, good move. White played rook f3. That attack wasn't really working. I think if queen h3 we would just go queen g5, no? Yeah, queen g5, and not so clear. I mean, white king is also a little shaky. No, we can attack it also. So not clear exactly who is attacking whom at this point. So rook f3 was played in the game. The rest is perhaps not that interesting. Black could trade rook queens already. They played king g8 first. It's nice to have the rook here like some kind of goalkeeper or bodyguard to the king, you would say. Knight e2. Now the knight is perhaps coming to somehow to the king side. So black took on h4, rook takes h4, king f8. We're bringing the king to e7, knight f4. Maybe there is some tactic coming up, so let's avoid that by playing king e7. Black is very safe in this position. You can see that nothing's really going on. Later on the game was a draw. Nice defensive action by black, and I would say this rook was the hero, you could say, in this movie. It's very useful for defensive purposes. So safe to say, this looks promising for white. Just looking superficially, you would say that black is getting killed here, but it's actually not completely true. These Sicilian positions are very resilient, you could say. King h8, very clever move, so that we can avoid white's concrete threats and also get ready to bring the rook to g8 a little later. Okay, I wanted to show you another example featuring another piece. Well, actually, we just saw it. We're talking about the queen, and that's what happens in our next example. In this game between Makar with white and Mark Hebden playing black, you can see that Hebden has sacrificed on h3, typical sacrifice. I think it was bishop takes h3, and white must have taken back, and black took with the queen. You can see right now white king is in big danger. Black has several pieces which would like to go to the king side and attack. But it's interesting, when I looked at this position, I also tried to understand what's black's concrete threat, because you would say, okay, we would love to play bishop e5 and mate them, but then white will play f4. Then the bishop will be a little shaky, but if we take on c3, they take with the queen and it's check. If you see what I mean, we're checking black now, right? So bishop e5 is actually not a concrete threat. Knight e5 is another interesting idea for black, trying to bring in the knight. But maybe that will just be a draw if white takes then the knight with the bishop. So that was interesting for me, trying to understand what was the main threat for white to take care of here. And actually the main threat is a strange threat, but it seems that the main threat is to play rook f5, to play rook f5, idea not clear yet, right? We cannot touch this square, we cannot touch that square. But once you put the rook on f5, then you would be ready to play bishop e5. And if white now prevents the mate on h2, if they prevent this mate by playing f4, at that point we would have this move, rook g5. Interesting, no? Because if they take it, they get mated. Okay, let's take it again. Black would like to play rook f5. It's a flexible attacking move, of course. You're bringing more pieces to the attack. But concretely speaking, the threat will be to play bishop e5 so that we threaten mate on h2. Okay, white will have to block the bishop by playing here obstructed, by playing f4. But in that case, when they play f4, we would play here the nice move, rook g5 check. Since they cannot take it, in that case, they are getting mated on h2. Interesting. So what white did here, I'm not sure if they noticed this pattern. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. But they were very practical. They saw very quickly that, aha, I can bring that piece to that square, and after that, my king is going to be very safe. So what did I play here? Aha, you got it. Queen, exactly, queen d5. Nice. It's not an attacking move, not at all. We're not after black's king. We're trying to get to g2 to safeguard the king in this way. Simple defensive maneuver. Actually, black's attack is coming to an end here, so what Hebden did very cleverly, he fixed the draw here. I guess his first intention was to take on e3, but if he does that, there is a problem for him, because white will take, and after queen takes e3, you can see that white will play king g2. What's going on here is that black would like to take on c3 and take on e2, but there is tension on the f file. We talked about this, I think, in a chapter about intermediate moves. We talked about the fact that when the rooks are on the same file, there is tension. That's always very tricky in tactical terms. You can say who is favored by this, who is favored by that, and so on. So here, for example, you can see black will not have time to take because white will then take on f8. Unfortunately, if black takes on f1 first, exactly, white would take them with the bishop, and they wouldn't lose the bishop anymore. So that's what Hebden noticed in the game, I think, and for that reason he played instead. Yeah, by the way, queen g3 in that variation, I could play queen g2, it wasn't a big difference. So what he played in the game, he took first on c3, so we're doing some tactics training here also. Move orders, right? First we take on c3, that's what Hebden did to save this game. B takes e3, rook takes e3. Now this works, because after f takes e3, queen takes e3, you can see that king g2 will just drop the bishop on e2. This would not be healthy for white. So they played instead king h1, and black went back to h3 king. Here, of course, black should not give check on g3 because then white fulfills their plan, the defensive queen maneuver to g2. So black played queen e3 instead, and the game was a draw here after repeating once more king h1, queen h3, king g1. So, simple example, yet very effective. We're bringing the queen to the defense. We're using this interesting route for the queen. In this way, we're able to meet black's threats. Yeah, you can see, by the way, that if they carry out the same plan that we talked about with rook f5, yeah, they're too slow here, of course. We're bringing the queen, and it's a different story now. They don't even have this mating pattern anymore, thanks to the presence of the queen. So something to remember, definitely. Swing over the queen to the defense. It can be done in this way, for example. If this was a simple example, wait until you see the next one, which is the opening which leads to the biggest complexities. Well, there are probably a bunch of them, but one of them is definitely the Sicilian Najdorf, and that's what we have in this next example. Not for the faint-hearted. This is a game between Martin Gonzalez with white and Christian Hernandez with the black pieces. You can see that, wow, the board is already on fire. Both sides, especially white, is playing for an attack here. So many pieces in the attack, crazy position. I was never good with the Najdorf. When I played it with white, I would play the most cautious systems with bishop e2 and things like that. This was not my cup of coffee, but I think it's very interesting to learn about this position. So basically what's going on here is that white is preparing a sacrifice. They want to take on g6 to break through on the g file. There is another idea, knight takes e6, with the same purpose, of breaking through. Black, on their side, they will of course like to attack white. White's king is also not that safe. Just one thing to notice here, the move c takes b2, we should definitely keep it in the pocket. Don't use it now, because they'll play king b1, using the pawn as a pawn shield. And, for example, the possible vulnerability of white's king along the c1, h6 diagonal is gone. So just keep the king there for black. Don't play c takes b2, please. Also, you have other ideas like queen b6 at some point, trying to mate them and so on. It will hurt your flexibility to play c takes b2. So what black did here, what Hernandez did, was very clever. He saw that, all right, right now I'm actually being outnumbered on the king side. Even if I would love to attack on the queen side, it's probably time to focus on defense. So he played here first. Bishop takes h4. Not clear that black really wanted to trade these bishops. But you can see that the move, like, for example, bishop g7, this would be far too slow. I think white will just break through here. Knight takes e6 and queen takes g6 would be very dangerous for black, sorry. So he played instead bishop takes h4. After queen takes h4, again, you will say, but terrible, so many threats. I'm going to die here very soon, you would say with black. But actually, it is possible to help the king. You just have to stick to our favorite topic in this chapter. You got it, mobilization. Who is coming to the defense? Well, we saw this in the other example in Vocaturo, Gomez Garrido. We saw black using the same idea. Here they used it again. Aha, queen d8. Very clever retreat in this way. In the first place, we're offering the trade of queens, which would help us on account of our weaker king. And secondly, the queen is finding a nice spot on f6, where it will help our defense. Don't get this wrong, the position is still very complex, but this is the right course of action, definitely. White played in the game queen h3 to keep up the attack. They could also play queen g3, of course. Yeah, they don't want to trade queens, definitely. But queen g3 could be played, and then we will play in the same way. Queen f6 again, giving some extra protection to our king in this case. And you can see that somehow the queen is also getting closer to the pawn in some the queen is getting closer to white's king. That's what I'm trying to say. In some variations here, who knows when it could appear. I think we have a variation like that later on. Let's see. Queen h3 was played in the game more critical, because now you can see also knight takes e6, and there are some ideas with it. Bringing the queen and so on. Black continued with their plan. Queen f6, and I think it was it around here that if white plays bishop takes g6, yeah, here you can actually see it. Here, black would have big problems after f takes g6, queen takes h6, were it not for this move, queen takes f4. So if you imagine this position, but you have included c takes b2 and king b1 earlier, you can take it for granted that rook takes g6 would be highly problematic for black at that point. For starters, the queen would be hanging. So this shows perhaps how we can keep some flexibility on the board by keeping the pawn tension, not taking on b2, it gives us this merit advantage or merit that we can take on f4 with a check, which has a huge importance, of course, in this kind of sharp position. So very nice move, queen f6 by black in this game. They played here in the game knight e2, so that they protect the pawn on f4 and also they get ready to take on c3. But also when white retreats the knight, it's like a relief for black. Now we can, yeah, take a sigh of relief here. They took the pawn eventually on b2 because now they saw that there was not so much danger and they didn't want white to just pick up the pawn. So white played here king b8, and at this point I think the game got complex again. Yeah, he played here king h7, black played king h7, and white played rook d6, and yeah, the game was still very, very complex. There are some ideas with, I think, e5, and white wants to put the queen on g2 and mate, or perhaps hit the rook on a8, something like that. But there was actually a nicer move here, a nicer move after king b1. So if we talk about the knight, could you, perhaps thinking back about the first examples in this chapter, could you think of some task for the knight? Where would the knight like to go to safeguard the king side? Aha, the knight would like to go to f8. So the rook will have to make space for it. This was actually an interesting move, rook d8. This was an interesting idea because in this way we can put the knight on f8. I think he didn't play it, Hernandez didn't play like this simply because he didn't want to give away the pawn like that. Rook takes d6. He didn't want to allow that. But I think this was the best course of game. I would play this way with black, knight f8. It's true that white can go e5 and take some more space. We have to play queen e7. So, of course, white is still attacking. We're still under some pressure. But I think the fact that the knight is on f8, it's very nice for us. We can hold on here for a while. And also, in the long run, black is fine now. We have a nice bishop. White's queenside structure is not so impressive here. Rook d1, that's what I looked at, the bishop e7. And it seems to me that black is okay here. Yeah, we don't want to take on d6. We don't want to give them a passed pawn. We simply keep on developing. Maybe we could put the bishop on d5 at some point to try to take on d6, if you see what I mean, next turn, something like that. Maybe some bishop maneuver to the defense also. So I think this would have been the best course of action. But okay, very complex example. I didn't show you all the variations here, but I picked some of them. But I wanted to see the big picture, that we would like to bring pieces to the defense. We have to act quickly before they break through by means of some sacrifice. And for that to happen, I think this is the best course of action. We should take on h4, not that we love to trade off our defending bishop, but this makes it possible to play queen d8 with tempo, with the threat of trading queens, and then we can bring the queen to f6. I think that's a key idea here. And in our last example, I wanted to show you an interesting situation where actually black can bring several pieces to the defense in order to save the skin of their king. In this game between Stefansson and Breuer, you can see that white has sacked on h6 recently, just like Hebden did with the black pieces. Now white did it on h6. And this is, of course, troublesome for black, right? Because you can see the threat here, the threats for white. They would like to put a knight on g5. They would like to put a knight on h5. They would then threaten to give mate on g7. If black would take on h5, we have mating patterns along h7, f7, and so on. So dangerous for black, this situation. Knight, if you think about the previous example, you would consider something like that to bring in the queen to f6, but as you can see, it backfires here after knight h5. White can threaten mate and at the same time avoid our plan. So not completely convincing, knight h7, else it's a typical maneuver that you can use on some occasions. So what black played in the game, let's see very quickly what happened in the game. They played rook e6, trying to bring in the rook to the defense, and here Stefansson carried out a very nice attack. He played queen g5 check first so as to safeguard the queen, and after king h8 he played e takes d5. So what do you think is the point of this move? Why did he take on d5, opening up the game? That's right. Sometimes when we are attacking, we need to somehow disrupt opponent's defense. The point here is that if you take with a knight, I think there is some issue with the queen, right? The queen is hanging. And if you take with a queen, there is an issue that your queen is not defending the knight anymore. So it has to do with both those pieces. Now, knight f5, now this is troublesome. We are missing the move queen g8. I think we missed that resource now. And if queen takes knight h6, but here we can't do it. So it's worse for us now. Knight e8, and what do you think white will play? Yeah, they need to think about mobilization as well. They would like to bring in the second knight, the knight on f3. I mean, it would like to join the party, and that can be done in this way, exactly. Queen h5, king g8, and knight e5. Very difficult for black because you can see there are now at least two different mating threats. Now, one would be to mate like this, but since we have a knight on f5, we can also think about mating like this and that, right? So, tough case for black here. What should they have played? Yeah, this is what happened in the game, so they had to play something else here. Or was this the game? No, it actually went like this. Okay, rook g6, and you can see the final blow here, of course. It's not the queen which will deliver the mate, it's actually one of the knights. Queen h7, king f8, queen h8 check, rook g8, and knight h7. Yeah, nice attack. Very well performed by Stefansson in this game. But what black could have done here to save the skin of their king was to, in first place, bring a bishop to the defense. Aha, which bishop? Definitely that bishop. Bishop c5, so that the bishop can come to f8. But that's not all of it. You will see that there is another function of this move, bishop c5. It also prepares another idea on the topic of mobilization. Let's see what could happen here. Queen g5 is what I looked at. If knight g5 to continue with this plan, you can see that black is just in time to do this. I call this the delayed fianchetto. It's common in some openings. Bishop f8 and put the bishop on g7. Very nice defensive ploy. We will look at this a little closer in chapter 22, I think, about prophylaxis. A very, very common defensive idea, prophylactic idea to safeguard the king's side. So more critical would be queen g5, so as to prevent this plan. Black would now play king f8, so that we keep this pawn protected, because the pawn on e5 will fall next turn, which is perhaps why black didn't play like this in the game. Knight takes e5, and here comes the key move, the move that we really want to play here. Aha, you got it. Bring more people to the defense, please. Rook b6, that's the idea here. Rook b6, so that we take control of the whole 6th rank, similar to Kramnik's game where he played rook a2, right, with white, covering the whole 2nd rank. Rook b6, very strong move, as you can see. Now black gets ready to play something like knight g8, and we can even swing over the rook to the king side to help the defense. So white could play something like b4, trying to interrupt with black's play a little. I think we'll have to put the bishop now on d6 to attack the knight, even if for the moment our rook is not participating, but it can participate later. Another variation here, of course, white could settle a draw here. They could play queen h6 check, and we will have to go back with the king. I think it would be too dangerous to go the other side, right? It would be too exposed on e7, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe something like queen g7 and yeah, even take and bring in the rook and so on. So it's safer to go to the other side. So white can make a draw here if they like, but okay, we can't get more on this occasion. So maybe more critical for white would be to play this move b4, include this move to hurt black's coordination a little, but after bishop d6, I'm not convinced what was wrong with bishop e7, but there must be a problem with this also. Yeah, what might be the problem? Queen h6 and maybe something with... Yeah, actually this looks possible as well. I can't really see how white progresses here, but okay, we win the tempo by playing bishop d6. We hit the knight, so that's also making sense. So what did I look at here? f4, trying to attack this, to protect this knight, and if they take with the pawn, obviously, and we open up the f file. But black could now play their key move here, knight g8. As you can see, very often backwards moves are involved in defensive play. We have to get used to this kind of thinking. The chess engine wanted to take on e4, but yeah, I like this approach more. It's more human. We like to bring in more pieces to the defense. You can also see that when we did this, we also avoided any issues with queen takes, rook takes, and knight c6. That's like a bonus that we have, thanks to this clever rook transfer. So queen h5, threatening mate in 1. Of course, we don't want to take, and we don't want to open up the f file, doing any favors to white. So queen f6, we bring another player to the defense. E takes d5, now white has won a pawn. Since we cannot take like that, I think there are problems again. So we would play here queen g7. So I think if we count the pawns here, I think actually white has a slight material advantage. Yeah, they actually have 8 pawns and we only have 4. So they have 4 pawns for the piece, right? But still, black is, I think, defending fairly well here. It's a little disorder on the board for black, but I'm happy that we have so many pieces around the king. Just remember what happened in the game. So this is much nicer. I looked at this move. I thought this was interesting, a logical move to bring the knight to the attack. But after bishop takes, pawn takes, we don't need to take on e5 with the rook. We could perhaps do that also. But I think maybe rook takes and queen takes could be dangerous. The other rook is coming also. So black has a much nicer move here. What do you think black should play? That's right, on the topic of bringing the pieces physically to the king's defense, we could play here rook h6 first. Very nice. Yeah, no tricks with rook takes because our knight, our proud knight, is defending the rook also. And you can see that next turn we can actually take on e5 without any issues. If they play something like, I don't know, queen f3, you could take on e5 and yeah, black's pieces are a little disorganized, but the important thing is that they are helping the king. So this looks rather nice for black, I would say. So after queen g7, perhaps something like rook a1, white is making normal moves. And so is black. The knight can come back, try to kick away white's queen here. And also, yeah, by the way, we could not take, of course, we could not take on g3 because of the mate. So we can play knight f6, and who knows, they can play something like queen h4. Maybe we can bring in the king to g8, something like that. And I think black is okay here. In any case, compared to the game, this is way better. So basically what we saw here was that black's king was in huge trouble. They definitely needed more pieces to the defense. One way of solving it was to play bishop c5, so that the bishop can come this way and the rook can join the defense along the sixth rank. So these were the examples that I wanted to show you on the topic of mobilization, how we can bring the pieces to help the king, bring the pieces to the defense of the king side in most cases. And if we do the quick recap here, we start with this example, Sorokin's knight maneuver. He simply brought the knight a little closer to the king, which made the king feel a lot safer. Not much calculation was really required on this occasion. In our next example, Schmidt-Thiel did the same thing. He brought his knight to the king side, where it made the kings feel a lot safer. The knight was rather useless on d2, so also by common sense we could easily find this move. Knight f1 heading for g3. We saw Moisenko doing something similar with the bishop. The bishop came to the long diagonal where it fought against black's attack against the g2 pawn. We saw how Yuri Vovk used a very similar bishop maneuver backwards again, bishop e8 going to g6 in order to safeguard black's king and also attack white in a better way on c2. We saw the game where Stengrimsson used the rook transfer, rook a6, rook g6. You have seen many examples of this in attacking situations where you swing over the rook by a3, h3, and you try to attack on the h-file. Here is the opposite case. We are using such a rook lift, but for purely defensive purposes. At least for now, it's about defense. We need to bring the rook to make black's king a little safer, specifically try to cover this pawn on g7. We saw Kramnik carry out a similar idea, rook a2 preparing f4, and the rook would really love to settle on this square on g2. Nice place for defensive purposes. We saw the game in the Sicilian battle, Vocaturo Gomez Garrido, where black played king h8 in the first place, avoiding immediate threats, but also getting ready to actually bring his rook a little later to g7, where it would defend the fragile pawn on h7. And we saw how Makar played queen d5 followed by queen g2. This was definitely something which helped their attack and their defense. Basically, it ruined black's attack. We saw Hernandez using a similar idea, but in a much more complex situation, queen trading the bishops and then quickly bringing the queen to f6 to help the king. Black's own attack will be suspended for now. We need to focus on defense because we are getting outnumbered there. And please notice the feature with not taking on b2. We should keep that piece of flexibility for the future, so to speak. We keep white's king on c1, so that, for example, at some point perhaps the queen will fall with check and things like that. Finally, we saw in the game Stefansson Breuer that Breuer could have brought the bishop and the rook to the defense, even if the pieces would take up slightly unusual places, at least the rook. It was very useful. It helped to avoid being outnumbered on the king side. We brought more pieces, and white, actually, queen and two knights, that's a great attacking team, but it was difficult for them to bring more pieces, which explains why black could keep the balance in that position. So very nice bishop maneuver, bishop c5, bishop f8, and not to be forgotten, this kind of rook lift along the third rank, or the sixth rank in this case. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.